I never planned to buy a horse that day. The autumn air was crisp as I walked through the auction yard, boots crunching on fallen leaves. Horses of every size and color stood in makeshift pens, their breath visible in the morning chill. I was there with my father, ostensibly to help him evaluate some cattle, but the horses kept drawing my attention. Then I saw her. Tucked in the corner of a weathered pen stood the most pathetic excuse for a horse I'd ever laid eyes on. She was a bay Mustang, or what was left of one. Her ribs showed through her dull coat like piano keys, and her hip bones jutted out at sharp angles. Her mane was tangled with burrs, and her eyes held a wildness that spoke of recent freedom on the range. "Don't even think about it," Dad muttered, following my gaze. He'd raised horses his entire life and could read my expression like an open book. "That one's nothing but trouble and vet bills." The auctioneer's voice crackled through the speakers, calling lot numbers with practiced efficiency. Other bidders walked past the skinny mare without a second glance, their attention focused on the flashier, well-fed horses that pranced and snorted in their pens. But something about this horse spoke to me. Maybe it was the way she stood apart from the others, proud despite her condition. Or perhaps it was the intelligence I glimpsed in her dark eyes when she briefly looked my way. Whatever it was, I felt an inexplicable pull toward this forgotten creature. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the auction grounds. Soon, it would be time for the horse sales to begin. I found myself gravitating back toward her pen, ignoring Dad's disapproving glances and the practical voice in my head warning me against making an emotional decision. The bidding started with the premium horses. Sleek quarter horses and registered paints brought good money as experienced horsemen evaluated conformation and bloodlines. I watched the process, my mind wandering to the thin mare waiting her turn. Dad stood beside me, occasionally pointing out flaws in the horses that brought top dollar. "See how that one's tied in at the knee? Won't stay sound for long," he'd mutter. Or, "Nice hip on that gelding, but he's got a mean eye." Sigh. When they finally brought out Lot 47, the skinny Mustang, a hush fell over the small crowd. She entered the ring with her head high, nostrils flared, every muscle tensed for flight. The auctioneer's assistant had to work to keep her moving in the small circle, and even then, she moved with the choppy, uncertain gait of a horse who'd never learned to trust humans. "Now here's a project horse, folks," the auctioneer announced with forced enthusiasm. "Young mare, good bone structure under all that potential." The crowd was largely silent. A few ranchers whispered among themselves, probably calculating feed costs versus the likelihood of getting her rideable. Most looked away, already focused on the next lot. "What am I bid for this Mustang mare?" Silence stretched across the ring. The auctioneer dropped his opening bid from 500 to 300, then to 200. Still nothing. "Do I hear 100? That's when my hand shot up, seemingly of its own accord. Dad's elbow connected sharply with my ribs, but it was too late. The auctioneer's gavel was already in motion. "Sold to bidder number 37. I'd just bought myself $100 worth of wild horse, and judging by the look on my father's face, I'd also bought myself a world of trouble. The mare stood trembling in the ring, and for the first time since raising my hand, doubt crept into my mind. Loading her into the trailer was our first real challenge. The skinny mare had never seen a horse trailer up close, and she wasn't about to trust it now. She planted her feet at the bottom of the ramp and refused to budge, her whole body trembling with fear and adrenaline. "Should have thought about this before you bid," Dad grumbled, though he was already uncoiling his rope. Despite his disapproval, he wasn't the type to leave me struggling alone. It took 3 of us and nearly an hour to convince her that the trailer wouldn't eat her alive. Even then, she loaded with wild eyes and flared nostrils, her hooves clattering against the aluminum floor as she fought for balance. The drive home was tense, with her thrashing around in the back every time we hit a bump or took a turn too fast. When we finally arrived at our small ranch, Unloading proved just as challenging. She burst from the trailer like a cork from a bottle, nearly knocking me over as she scrambled to get her feet under her on solid ground. Her sides heaved with exhaustion and terror. We'd prepared the round pen for her arrival, and getting her into it required more patience and persistence. Once inside the circular enclosure, she immediately began pacing the perimeter, testing every board and post for weakness. Her hooves wore a path in the dirt as she circled endlessly, never taking her eyes off us for long. "Well, there's your $100, Dad said, leaning against the fence. "Hope you got a plan, because that horse doesn't trust humans as far as she can throw them." I stood watching her pace, beginning to understand the magnitude of what I'd taken on. This wasn't just a thin horse that needed feeding up. This was a wild animal who'd lived free until recently, and every instinct she possessed told her that humans meant danger. Her previous experiences with people clearly hadn't been positive ones. As evening approached, I threw her some hay and filled her water trough, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. She watched my every move from the far side of the pen, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. The next morning brought the first real glimpse of what I was dealing with. I approached the round pen with a flake of hay, and she exploded into motion, racing around the perimeter like her life depended on it. Her hooves thundered against the packed earth, and foam began to gather at the corners of her mouth from exertion and stress. "Easy, girl," I called softly, but my voice only seemed to agitate her more. I dropped the hay near the gate and backed away, giving her space to approach it on her own terms. She waited until I was completely out of sight before cautiously approaching the food, her head raised high, ears swiveling constantly for signs of danger. Dr. Henderson, our local veterinarian, stopped by that afternoon for a wellness check. One look at the mare sent him shaking his head. "She's probably dropped 200 pounds from stress and poor feed," he observed, making notes in his book. "Severe malnutrition, possible parasite load, and that's just what I can see from here." Getting close enough for a proper examination was impossible. Even with the mare in the round pen, she pressed herself against the far rail whenever we approached. Dr. Henderson left me with dewormers and vitamin supplements, along with instructions for a careful refeeding program. "Don't try to put weight on her too fast," he warned. "Her digestive system needs time to adjust. Small, frequent meals of good quality hay and grain." Dad helped me establish a routine. Morning and evening feedings, always approaching the same way, speaking in low, calm tones. The mare would retreat to her safe spot and watch as I filled her feed bucket and refreshed her water. She wouldn't approach until we were well out of sight. By the end of the first week, she'd stopped the frantic pacing, though she remained hyper-alert to our presence. I began to notice small details. The way her left ear had a small notch, probably from a fight or accident. The irregular white marking on her forehead that looked almost like a lightning bolt. The intelligent way she assessed every situation before reacting. 3 weeks passed before I saw the first sign of progress. I was refilling her water trough when I noticed she hadn't retreated to the far side of the pen. Instead, she stood about 15 feet away, watching me work. Her body was still tense, ready for flight, but she was choosing to stay closer. "That's something, I guess," I murmured, careful not to make direct eye contact, which I'd learned she perceived as a threat. The daily routine was becoming second nature. Morning chores started with checking on her, noting her body language and condition. She was beginning to fill out slightly, though her ribs were still clearly visible. More importantly, her coat was starting to show hints of the rich brown color hidden beneath the dull sun-bleached hair. I started spending more time near the pen, not always with a specific purpose. Sometimes I'd sit on an upturned bucket outside the fence, reading or just watching the world go by. At first, she'd pace nervously when I was there, but gradually she began to accept my presence as part of her environment. Dad observed these sessions with skeptical interest. "Waste of time, sitting there like a fence post," he'd mutter. But I caught him watching too, noting the small changes in her behavior. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday morning. I approached with her breakfast as usual, but instead of retreating, she took just 2 steps back and stopped. Her ears were forward, focused on the feed bucket rather than on me. For the first time, she was showing more interest in food than fear of humans. I set the bucket down and stepped back, but not as far as usual. She waited, head raised, testing the air. Then, with deliberate steps, she approached the bucket while I was still relatively close. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. "Progress," I whispered to Dad later. He grunted non-committally, but I thought I detected a hint of approval in his expression. The rain continued throughout the day, and I found myself checking on her more frequently, worried about her standing in the weather with her still thin condition. By the 6th week, our morning routine had evolved into something resembling a conversation. She would watch for my approach, positioning herself where she could see the feed bucket, but still maintain her safe distance. Sometimes she'd make soft, nickering sounds, which I chose to interpret as her version of "good morning." I began talking to her during feeding time, keeping my voice low and conversational. "Looking better today, girl. That rain yesterday left everything pretty muddy, didn't it?" Her ears would flick toward me when I spoke, though she remained ready to bolt at any sudden movement. Progress was measured in inches rather than miles, but it was definitely progress. The day I decided to name her, she was standing in a patch of morning sunlight, and the light caught the reddish highlights in her brown coat. Combined with that lightning bolt marking on her forehead, the name came to me instantly: Storm. "What do you think about Storm?" I asked her during the evening feeding. One ear swiveled toward me while the other remained focused on potential escape routes. "Seems fitting for a horse who blew into my life like wild weather." Dr. Henderson returned for a follow-up visit and was pleased with her physical progress. She'd gained weight steadily, and her coat was beginning to develop a healthy sheen. More importantly, she no longer looked like a horse expecting to die. "Psychologically, she's coming along too," he observed, noting how she no longer pressed herself against the far fence when we were near. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." That weekend, I tried something new. Instead of leaving immediately after feeding, I sat down outside the pen with my back against a fence post. Storm finished eating and then, to my amazement, didn't retreat. She stood about 10 feet away, studying me with curious eyes. We stayed like that for nearly an hour, she standing alert but relaxed, me sitting quietly and trying not to make any sudden movements. It was our first real moment of peaceful coexistence, and it felt like a major milestone in our relationship. 2 months in, Storm had transformed physically. Her ribs no longer showed, her coat gleamed with health, and she moved with the fluid grace of a horse who was finally feeling good. But the real test was yet to come. If she was ever going to be more than an expensive lawn ornament, she needed to accept human touch. I started by simply reaching toward the fence while she ate. At first, any movement of my hand sent her skittering backward, but gradually she learned that my reaching toward the fence didn't mean immediate danger. It took 2 weeks before I could rest my hand on the top rail while she was eating from a bucket just feet away. The morning I finally touched her was unremarkable in every way except for what happened. She was focused on her grain, and my hand was resting on the fence rail as usual. On impulse, I slowly extended one finger toward her neck. She tensed, but didn't move away. My finger barely grazed her coat, the lightest possible touch, but the connection was electric. She threw her head up, startled, but after a moment of evaluation, she lowered it again and continued eating. I had touched a wild Mustang, and the world hadn't ended. Dad witnessed the moment from across the yard and walked over afterward. "Well, I'll be," was all he said, but his tone carried a grudging respect I hadn't heard before. Over the following days, I gradually increased the contact. A finger became a whole hand. A brief touch became longer moments of connection. Storm learned that human hands could bring comfort as well as food, and something fundamental shifted in our relationship. The day she actively leaned into my touch was the day I knew we'd crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer just tolerating human presence. She was beginning to seek it out. Her wild edges were softening, replaced by a growing trust that felt both fragile and precious. I began to envision possibilities beyond simply having a pet horse in the pen. Maybe, just maybe, Storm could become something more. Teaching Storm to accept a halter took 3 weeks of patient work. The first time I slipped it over her head, she froze like a statue, every muscle rigid with tension. But she didn't fight, and that felt like a victory in itself. Leading was another challenge entirely. A horse that had never been asked to follow a human had to learn an entirely new concept. Our first walks consisted of me taking one step while Storm planted her feet and stared at me in confusion. Progress was measured in single steps, then groups of steps, until finally we could walk the perimeter of the round pen together. "You're making this way more complicated than it needs to be," Dad observed one afternoon, watching me coax Storm through a simple backing exercise. But I was learning that Storm required a different approach than the domestically bred horses Dad was used to. Every new experience had to be introduced gradually, with time for her to process and accept each new concept before moving on to the next. The saddle pad nearly undid all our progress. Despite weeks of preparation, the moment that first pad settled on her back, Storm exploded. She bucked and twisted with a violence that reminded me just how wild she'd been not so long ago. The round pen shuddered under the impact of her hooves against the rails. I waited for the storm to pass, speaking in calm tones while she worked through her panic. When she finally stood still, sides heaving, I slowly approached and removed the pad. We'd try again tomorrow. It took 2 weeks before she'd accept the pad without drama, and another week before the saddle itself could stay on her back for more than a few minutes. Each session required patience, repetition, and the kind of trust that could only be built over time. The day I finally swung my leg over her back was anticlimactic. After months of preparation, she simply stood there, ears flicked back toward me, accepting this new weight with resignation rather than panic. Our first real ride lasted exactly 37 seconds. I had barely settled into the saddle when Storm decided she'd had enough of this new experience. She took off across the round pen like she'd been shot from a cannon, and I found myself hanging on for dear life. She wasn't bucking exactly, but she wasn't listening either. Her wild instincts had kicked in, and every fiber of her being was focused on getting this predator off her back. I managed to stay centered until she made a sharp turn that physics wouldn't allow me to follow, and I found myself face down in the dirt. Dad, who had been watching from the fence, was there immediately to help me up. "You hurt?" he asked, dusting off my jacket. "Just my pride," I replied, though my hip was going to be sore for days. Storm stood at the far side of the pen, sides heaving, looking as shaken as I felt. But she wasn't trying to escape the saddle or throwing herself against the fence. She was processing what had just happened, trying to make sense of this new experience. I spent the rest of that session just sitting in the pen with her, letting her see that I wasn't angry or frightened. Trust, once broken, is harder to rebuild than it is to establish in the first place, and I couldn't afford to let fear enter our relationship now. The next day, I was back in the saddle. This time, Storm managed a few calm steps before her nerves got the better of her. The day after that, we made it halfway around the pen before she felt the need to express her opinions about the situation. Each ride was a negotiation, a conversation between a horse learning to carry a rider and a human learning to think like a horse. Storm was teaching me as much as I was teaching her, showing me what it meant to approach training with patience rather than dominance. By the end of the month, we could walk calmly around the round pen together, though I could feel the coiled energy in her body, ready to explode if something spooked her. The day I opened the gate to the round pen and rode Storm into the larger pasture was both exhilarating and terrifying. After months of working in the confined space, the open area seemed vast and full of potential dangers that could send her into a panic. She stepped through the gate with her head raised high, nostrils flared as she processed all the new sights and smells. Every shadow was a potential predator, every sound a possible threat. I could feel her tension through the saddle, her body coiled like a spring ready to release. "Easy, girl," I murmured, keeping my hands light on the reins and my seat deep in the saddle. Our first circuit of the pasture was an exercise in controlled chaos. Storm spooked at a piece of plastic caught in the fence, shied away from the water trough she'd drunk from hundreds of times, and nearly unseated me when a rabbit bolted from under a bush. But each time she settled back into our rhythm, learning to trust my voice and the steady pressure of my legs against her sides. Dad watched from the fence, and I could see him fighting between his natural tendency to criticize and a growing respect for what we'd accomplished together. "She's got good movement when she's not trying to jump out of her skin," he called out, which was the closest thing to a compliment I'd heard from him about Storm. Over the following weeks, our rides expanded beyond the pasture. We explored the dirt roads around our property, with Storm gradually learning that cars weren't predators and dogs weren't wolves. Each new experience required patience and careful introduction, but her confidence was growing with every successful encounter. The afternoon we encountered our neighbor's cattle was a turning point. Storm's ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm, and I could feel her natural cow sense engaging. For the first time, she showed me a glimpse of what she might become, a working partner, rather than just a riding horse. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. Storm had been under saddle for 6 months, and while our relationship had deepened considerably, she was still very much a work in progress. That's when Dad suggested something that surprised me. "There's a sorting competition next month," he said over breakfast. "Nothing fancy, just local ranchers working cattle. Might be good for her to see what real work looks like." I stared at him, fork halfway to my mouth. "You want to take Storm to a cattle sorting?" "Want to see what you've really got there," he replied with a shrug. "Besides, time to find out if all this gentle training actually produces a horse worth riding." The idea was both exciting and terrifying. Storm had come so far from the skeletal creature I'd bought at auction, but asking her to work cattle in a competitive environment seemed like a huge leap. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing her for the experience. We practiced in different environments, worked around our own small herd of cattle, and focused on building her confidence in chaotic situations. Storm seemed to thrive on having a job to do, her natural intelligence and athletic ability becoming more apparent with each session. The night before the competition, I sat in her stall, brushing her gleaming coat and talking through my nerves. "Tomorrow's the big test, girl. Time to show everyone what a $100 horse can really do." She nuzzled my shoulder, a gesture that would have been impossible when we first met. The wild, terrified horse from the auction had been replaced by a willing partner who trusted me enough to face new challenges. The morning of the competition dawned clear and cool. As I loaded Storm into the trailer, she stepped in calmly, a far cry from that first traumatic loading experience. Dad drove while I sat in the passenger seat, trying to quiet the butterflies in my stomach. "She'll do fine," Dad said, glancing at me. "Question is, will you?" The sorting competition was held at a local ranch, with teams of riders and horses working together to separate specific cattle from a herd. The atmosphere was casual but competitive, filled with experienced cowboys and their seasoned horses. When we unloaded Storm, she stepped out calmly despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Her ears were up and alert, taking in all the new sights and sounds, but there was none of the panic I'd feared. She stood quietly while I tacked her up, though I could feel the coiled energy in her body. "Nice-looking horse," commented an older rancher, walking past with his own mount. "Got some size on her." "What's her breeding?" "Mustang," I replied, swinging into the saddle. He paused, looking more closely at Storm. "No kidding?" "Well, should be interesting." I could hear the skepticism in his voice, and I knew Storm and I would have to prove ourselves. Wild horses weren't exactly common in these competitions, and many people still thought of Mustangs as untrainable. Our first run was scheduled for mid-morning. As we waited our turn, I walked Storm around the arena, letting her observe the other horses working. She watched intently as riders and horses cut individual cattle from the herd, her ears pricked forward with obvious interest. When our number was called, I rode into the arena with my heart pounding. The cattle bunched together at the far end, and our job was to cut out the 3 animals wearing yellow tags. Storm tensed beneath me as we approached the herd, every muscle coiled for action. "Easy, girl," I murmured, settling deeper into the saddle. "Let's show them what we can do." The moment we engaged with the cattle, something magical happened. Storm's natural instincts took over, and suddenly I was riding a horse that seemed to know exactly what was needed. She moved with fluid precision, anticipating the cattle's movements and responding to the slightest shift in my weight. We successfully sorted all 3 animals in well under the time limit, working together like we'd been doing this for years. The crowd's reaction to our successful run was gratifying, but nothing compared to the look on Dad's face as we rode out of the arena. For the first time since I'd bought Storm, I saw genuine pride in his expression. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, shaking his head. "That horse has got more cow sense than most of the fancy-bred ones here." Word spread quickly through the competition about the Mustang mare that could work cattle. Between events, people approached to ask about Storm's training and background. Each conversation was an opportunity to share her story, from the terrified skeleton at the auction to the confident working horse she'd become. "How long did it take to get her going?" asked a young woman with a high-strung thoroughbred that was dancing sideways. "About 8 months to get her rideable," I replied, stroking Storm's neck. "But really, she's been teaching me as much as I've been teaching her." Our second run went even better than the first. Storm seemed to understand the game now, and she attacked the work with enthusiasm that bordered on joy. Watching her move through the herd, separating cattle with surgical precision, I was struck by how far we'd both traveled from that first day in the round pen. The competition results were announced as the sun began to set. Storm and I didn't win, but we placed respectably in a field of experienced competitors. More importantly, we'd proven that with patience and trust, even the most challenging horses could become willing partners. As we loaded up to go home, several people asked if Storm was for sale. The offers were tempting, representing many times what I'd paid for her, but the answer was easy. "She's not for sale," I told them. "Some horses are partners, not just investments." Dad nodded approvingly at my response. "Smart answer. Horse like that you don't find very often." On the drive home, Storm rode calmly in the trailer, tired but satisfied from the day's work. I found myself thinking about the journey we'd taken together, from mutual distrust to genuine partnership. A year after buying Storm at the auction, I found myself back at the same venue, this time helping Dad evaluate some young prospects. The autumn air carried the same crisp promise, and the sounds and smells of the auction yard brought back vivid memories of that impulsive decision that changed both our lives. Storm waited patiently in the trailer, no longer the terrified creature who'd fought every step of the loading process. She'd become my go-to horse for ranch work, blessed with intelligence, athleticism, and a work ethic that put many pampered horses to shame. "See anything that catches your eye?" Dad asked, nodding toward a pen full of weanlings. I looked them over with an experienced eye, noting conformation and temperament, but my attention was drawn to a different pen. There, standing alone and ignored by most of the browsers, was a thin bay gelding with the unmistakable look of recent wildness in his eyes. "Not really," I replied, though I couldn't stop looking at the forgotten horse. Dad followed my gaze and chuckled. "Don't even think about it. One project horse is enough." But I was already walking toward the pen, drawn by something familiar in the horse's stance. He had the same proud defiance Storm had shown, the same intelligence hidden behind wariness and fear. He was older than Storm had been, probably 4 or 5, which would make him more challenging to train. "You're not seriously considering another one," Dad said, but his tone held more amusement than disapproval. I thought about Storm, confident and strong, working cattle like she was born to it. I thought about the partnership we'd built through patience and trust, and how it had enriched both our lives in ways I hadn't expected. "Maybe," I admitted, watching the bay gelding watch me back. The auction was still hours away, giving me time to observe and think. But deep down, I already knew how this story would end. Some horses choose you as much as you choose them, and looking into this gelding's eyes, I felt that familiar spark of connection. Thank you so much for listening to Storm's story and mine. This journey from auction house to partnership has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, and I hope it inspires you to look beyond the surface when evaluating potential in both horses and life. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What part of the world are you listening from? Have you ever taken on a project that seemed impossible but turned out to be life-changing? Please share your stories. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales from ranch life. Your support means everything to this small-town horse trainer, and I can't wait to share more adventures with you. Until next time, remember that sometimes the best things come in the most unexpected packages.